Hej, dobrý deň, vítajte všetci. Srdečne vás vítam v mene Inštitútu estetiky a umeleckej kultúry a keď dovolíte, ja hneď aj switchnem do anglického jazyka, keďže naša dnešná prednáška bude v znení anglickom, aby nás všetci rozumeli, tak ja sa pokúsim, prepáčte mi prípadné chybičky. Okay, welcome everybody. It is great to see you here, and now let me tell you several words to introduce our dear guest. Welcome to Institute of Aesthetics and Art Culture, and I would like to say hello to you who are here with us in this room. And also, I would like to say hello to everybody who is watching us via Google Meet online. So, hello wherever you are. And now I would like to introduce our special guest who is gonna have lecture for us today. And as you know from our Facebook event and so on. Our lecturer today is Professor Michael Lucas, and we are very happy to have him at our institute the whole winter term, the whole semester, because he's a very esteemed and very dear colleague of us. So thank you very much to be with us here. And now let me say several words or several notes from his very interesting and from his very colorful biography, and I'm going to read it to not forget anything. Okay, so Michael Lucas is Professor Emeritus in Architecture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California, USA. Following his Master's of Architecture degree at Morgan State University in Baltimore in 1995, his career has focused on teaching, pedagogy, and research in application of phenomenology. He has taught at Cal Poly, California Polytechnics, since 1997, receiving tenure in 2004. Buildwork, where he acted as designer, earned awards from Cincinnati, is this good pronunciation? Mm-hmm. Cincinnati, Central Pennsylvania, and Baltimore chapters of the American Institute of Architects, and received publication in Progressive Architecture magazine. He received the Cal Poly Distinguished Teacher Award in 2008, the first professor from the College of Architecture and Environmental Design to be so honored in almost 20 years. Michael's research is in the area of human development and spatial concept formation, place and identity, specifically looking at the junction of individual tacit, phenomenological and intuitive knowing with cultural conventions and disclosure of architectural and environmental attitudes. His studies focused initially on indigenous Pacific Northwest and Pueblo Native American settings and 20th century American vernacular situations. These interests developed into the areas of eco-phenomenology and environmental ethics and expanded to settings as diverse as Finland, Turkey, and UK, as well as application in his pedagogy. In addition to his academic positions, he served as College of Architecture and Environmental Design Associate Dean of Academic Affairs in term between 2014 and 2017. For his contributions to the university, he was awarded the honorary title Emeritus in 2017. Except his classes, he is going to deliver a lecture. It is, we are very looking forward to it. It is a keynote lecture with title Architecture as Gathering Time at our annual conference with title Coordinates of Aesthetics, Art and Culture 7, and it will be on November 11th next month, so you are invited too. And this is very interesting in terms of his research stay in Slovakia. He initiates a research project which is called Dých života, breathing life into the Slovak wooden churches of the Carpathian Mountains, aesthetics and embodiment in the wooden churches of Slovakia, applying his finding on phenomenological inquiry in field studies of the setting of several of the 17th and 18th century wooden churches in the Bardejov and Dukla Pass areas of Slovakia. I have just one small technical remark. Please, those students, colleagues, and friends who are online, if you will have some remarks, notes, or questions, just write it down to the chat at Google Meet, and then after the lecture, I will read it to Michael. So we are looking for fruitful discussions. And now I would like to thank you for being with us, and please enjoy the lecture.
Well, thank you. I'm extremely pleased to be here. I've had a very generous and thoughtful introduction to this culture from my colleagues on the faculty. And I really cherish my being hosted here by the school. And you'll see some ties into why that's more important to me in a little bit. But I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm happy to see some of my students here. I'm very happy to have this chance to talk to you about America. I'm here because of a group called the Fulbright organization, and they sponsor Americans to be here to teach English as well as do some research and teaching. So I'm happy for Fulbright Slovakia and Fulbright in America for providing resources to support me here. So, sorry, the left part's squeezed a little bit, but I'm an American, but I'm not. Americans are about identity, and my identity is hyphenated. So I actually have 5 European identities. The Norse people in my genetic pool came to Scotland. The Scots people then came over here. I have people from the southwest of England and Cornwall. I have people from the northern part of Croatia on the border with Slovenia. And my grandmother was an immigrant from this part of the world in Slovakia in the early part of the 20th century. So all those purple dotted people came over to number 1 on the map of the United States. That's Pittsburgh, where I grew up, very important to Central European immigration. And then where I went to school in Cincinnati is number 2. And then where I practiced architecture for about 20 years is number 3 in Baltimore area, the Chesapeake Bay area, or as we call it, the Central Atlantic coast. I turned into an academic the second half of my number cat lives that I have, and went to the West Coast. And so the dock on the left up there is San Luis Obispo, midway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. If you're imagining it's one of the most beautiful parts of the world, you are correct. It is. I'm fantastically lucky to have lived my life in amazing places. But the research that was spoken about is in the Pacific Northwest that you see up there, Vancouver Island, and the southwest part of what's today British Columbia, the Puget Sound area, and mostly in the American Southwest that you see surrounding that orange, desiccated, rocky-looking part of the southwest part of the United States. And that research goes on, but I've been fortunate to have grants to study in Finland. I've taught in our Cal Poly London program, and I've had a recent chance to be in Turkey as well as the Pyrenees between Spain and France. So those are places that are I think you need time to develop thinking about something. And each of those places I've been at between a few weeks and a few months to live. It's more than just a visit. So I'm very fortunate. But this is where it starts. One side of my family went to a fold in the Appalachian Mountains and were farmers. And this is one of my ancestral farm pieces that my grandfather left this area, but returned later in his life and built a cabin and raised Christmas trees. And I spent many summers up there helping him trim Christmas trees. And down the lane that you see there in the stone path, connected the cabin to this barn. And so I grew up with this as a really beautiful vernacular agrarian part of my life. And when I go to the mountains, to the small villages and I see the farms, it reminds me very much of this landscape, although the architecture is completely different. The other side of my family, the Slovak family side, came to Pittsburgh, and they were 19th century immigrants. And they came there for work, and Pittsburgh was a major steel producing area, and my grandfather, the firstborn American from the Croatian side, was an electrician in steel mills. And so this is the largest steel mill on the left, Homestead Works. Pittsburgh, not the steel industry, because so much of the materials for steel came by barge, a boat loaded with coal or other minerals. And so this was a major part of the expansion of American industry at the time that gave those people work that came here. And on the right-hand side, you can see by 1999, that had been turned into a shopping mall. As much things in America end up happening, they get turned into shopping malls. The purple does outline one thing I'll get back to maybe at the end. They did keep a set of the stacks from the steel mill as some kind of small memory of what used to be there, as kind of honoring the past. And but I worked here when I was working my way through summer for university. I worked in Homestead Works as a laborer, so I've sweated many a summer day in that picture on the left. But what interested me about architecture was not so much the forms, it was the experience of architecture and the way that landscape and architecture are bequeathed. You give them the sense of architecture. They don't earn it, you give it to them. And so that requires something not about form, but maybe something is from your interaction with form. So I've always loved this piece of Heidegger's where he talks about how the material evidence of the picture in Van Gogh's shoes, he creates a whole world about what that person was like from the material evidence that's there in that picture. And that's one of the things I've tried to do with my studies. I try to understand more the world that's evolving from the material things I see rather than just looking at the material things themselves. So that means we go out a lot. When I first took the job in California, we thought about where can I apply some of this thinking, and we decided on the indigenous peoples in the American Southwest. So I'm always thankful to my partner Anne, who's gone with me almost every summer in some kind of camping situation in the American Southwest. So sometimes it's like this and very beautiful in the high desert outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. And sometimes it looks like this, which is the desiccated part of New Mexico, where the summer temperatures go up into the 40+ degree range, and a place where there's no water even today, and limited facilities. So we do this for research, and we do it. We actually think this is fun. It may not be your idea of fun, but we think this is fun. And so part of what I've learned there is to appreciate the material differences. As I talked to my students just a few weeks ago, the idea of adobe, one of the major materials of the Southwest, is you can't impose your formal principles on it. You have to learn a different set of formal principles and why it was created this way. How it was made is the way it looks. And so this idea of the impossibility of a straight line in adobe, I think, is a fantastic place to start thinking about the way the making of something and the culture creates a totally different world. And I've watched how how that kind of thinking is expanded into some of the Pueblo worlds that are there. These are people that are living on their ancestral lands, much smaller area than they used to have as their life world, but still living there. And so this is the restoration of Okeowinge, which is one of the major Pueblos. And this is the finished product of a portion of that working. And you see the pickup truck that drives through, and you can actually see the traces of the pickup truck's tires through the gravel, but you can see they carefully missed that little bit of stone in the center. That's because for ceremonial purposes, when there's no pickup trucks here and there might be 200 or 300 people dancing and another 300 or 400 people watching from the rooftops, that's a symbolic point of emergence within their spiritual thinking. So there's a shrine right in the middle of a parking lot, right in the middle of a reinvented Pueblo. But my friends at Zuni took a different path. They reinvented their architecture and ceremonial spaces by looking at a stone veneer that came from the local hills to put on top of wood construction. So this idea of here's two different pueblos only half hour away from each other that have really different material thinking about the way they should be taking care of their landscape and their cities. And part of this pays attention to what else is happening. So the Hispanic area around there has this beautiful sense of growing things. The Spanish settlers, and then who became independent Mexican settlers before they became American settlers, had this amazing ability to grow these chilies that are prized in this part of the world. So you'll see roadside stands show up everywhere. So if you're interested in the vernacular, you're interested in the mission, which was the Catholic Church that was built. You're interested in the pueblo, which is the tradition. You're also interested in what do they sell and what do these roadside stands look like. So this is one that also has some religious paraphernalia associated with it. And then you look at some of these places that are just oddities that show up. This is a mining village in Arizona. There was some really amazing mineral content in the mountains in the Southwest. And so you'd find these very specific towns that would be built up just on mining particular areas. And I know you have mines in Slovakia, so I know that's something you're familiar with. But many of these are ghost towns now. So this one called Oatman was one that they used a lot of donkeys to work the mining processes. And when the mine went away, the donkeys stayed. And so now there's a feral donkey herd that wanders this part of the world. And they'll wander into town because they know the tourists will feed them. And the path of the road is the famous Route 66, which goes across America, that was popular in the 1950s through today. So it's this bizarre mix of beautiful landscape, interesting idea about the history of mining, the remnant of the mine with the donkeys, and then this crazy kitsch vernacular that grows up around Route 66. And the other thing I've learned from this is to pay attention to the landscape. And the landscape is something that ecological thinking emerges from understanding climate and geology, but it also can turn on a dime. So one of the things that's really beautiful about our part of the world is if we have a wet winter instead of the drought that we're in, we may have in a few months what we call a super bloom. And everyone will get out in their car to see the wildflowers blooming. And so these areas of purple and yellow that you would see here would normally be desiccated. They'd just be dirt. But after a winter rain, they'll come back like this. It's very important to us to see that life quality coming back in a place that seems to be lifeless so much. But if I look at these two holidays, I'll start with Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving goes back to the European colonists from England coming to the part of America we call Massachusetts now in 1620. And so the Mayflower brought them here and they disembarked and they set up a colony. And in 1621, supposedly they had a successful harvest and put a 3-day gathering together to celebrate the harvest. And they also, it was attended by members of the Wampanoag tribe, the indigenous peoples of that area. And it's from that we derive this idea of Thanksgiving. So if you look at this painting, this is part of the American mythology that's built up, is that these pilgrims who came here partially to put a theological state together. There's an idea that they left persecution for being their religious beliefs in England, but they also came here to establish a theological colony for themselves. And you get this sense that everything is calm and there is that sense of reverence for the people and place that they're in. But the real name Thanksgiving was from a massacre a few years later. The colony was a success, the native population was in the way, so they massacred them. And this is the colonial way of America, is the colonies push, they annihilate the native population, they push them away. And so this idea that there was this kind of peaceful coexistence it may have a grain of truth for a certain period of time, but ultimately it's not. Ultimately, it's based on a lie. So some people knowingly know that this comes from genocide. It's Thanksgiving for not having the Native Americans here, as opposed to being thankful for the relations we have with the earth and our fellow members of this place with the harvest. But this narrative of origin of Thanksgiving continues as this meme myth. And you see these paintings. This one's from 1995, where, again, you'll see the happy colony with their indigenous people. And that's the way most Americans want to cherish that moment. But it's built around a turkey. Was there turkey at the first Thanksgiving? Even that's debatable. So the facts of Thanksgiving are just crazy. But the great part about it is experts agree that if they had some kind of wild fowl there, probably goose or duck or turkey, served along with the venison or the deer that the indigenous people would have brought. So one thing I want to tell you about American culture, turkey is the unchanging foundation of every Thanksgiving dinner in America. That's a reasonably successful cooked turkey. But how do you cook the turkey? It's a really hard thing. It's because of its size, the breast meat, where most of the weight of the turkey is, it's so dry. It takes so long to cook it, it dries out. So the challenge to every cook at Thanksgiving is, how do you cook the turkey without drying out the breast meat? And so there's a variety of means, foils and preparations and things you put in the cavity of the turkey, and the length of time you cook it, you smoke it. And recently there's been a fad, it's kind of going down a bit, of deep frying the turkey. You actually put it in a cylinder of boiling fat. Sounds great. Actually, it tastes pretty great too. We went to one Thanksgiving or one event where someone had a fried turkey. It's a very dangerous way to cook it, but it was actually very good. But the turkey's a fantastic bird. In the beginning of the founding of America as a country, there was a debate about what would be the American symbol. And the one that won, of course, that's on our currency and everything, is the American eagle. But Ben Franklin, who you may be familiar with, he was one of the great Americans at the time, who actually came to Europe quite a bit to negotiate, especially with the French, trying to get help to defeat Britain. Ben Franklin thought the turkey might be a good one to have. And I agree with Ben Franklin. He says the bald eagle is a bird of bad moral character. He doesn't get his living honestly. He's too lazy to fish for himself. Eagles are scavengers. But the turkey was this amazing bird that was indigenous to America, and he said was a true original native of America. Maybe a little vain and silly, because they pop their feathers up and things like that, but a bird of courage, he said. So we actually have them where I live. This is a feral turkey flock that wanders through our town. So on the top here, these are all, they're on my deck. They're on the terrace outside my house, right outside where I work on my computer, through the blinds there. They're absolutely fearless. And you can see on the one on the lower right, they've got some pretty big talons. They've got some feet that can do some damage. So I want to see if this works. So we're getting ready to leave with our car, and they're leaving our driveway. So I think if you paid attention, you may have counted as many as 12 there, and that seems to be the low end of our local flock. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So Norman Rockwell created this image that in some ways is the iconic image of Thanksgiving for Americans. And it was put together in 1943, so that's in the middle of the Second World War. So some people assailed him for having this lavish bounty in the middle when most of the world was starving. during World War II. And I don't disagree with that. But if I take it out of that, it also talks about capturing a sense of immediacy. That if you consider what was happening in the world, this was a way to forget about it for a moment. We have one little moment here of being in this moment that's beautiful with our family. And amidst the other realities in the world, this is something that is stable and beautiful. And so that focus on this family gathering is an important component that travels with Christmas today for Americans. And in fact, most people will recognize that as many, if not more, Americans will travel to be with family over Thanksgiving than Christmas. It's really a busy holiday. But every variation, every icon has its variations. So, people will own this in totally different ways. So there actually is a website you can go to called Family Thanksgiving Fails. And I pulled two of these off of there because this is the way that some of those symbols just become almost out of hand and get into that kitsch range. But it's a heartfelt thing, even if it ends up being a realization that we might say fails. This idea of gathering, though, as communities felt this, especially after the war, things like parades would be built around it. So here's one in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the massacre. Okay, so here they're celebrating this over-the-top, you might say, idea of America and Thanksgiving. And it turns into a big community kind of event. And it wasn't lost on the retailers. So Macy's is one of the big department store, I'm not sure what the equivalent here is, but one of the larger stores that you could buy lots of your clothes and durable goods, furniture, and things like that. Macy's decided we can establish Thanksgiving as a way to introduce Christmas. We'll have a giant parade and we'll bring in Santa Claus at the end, and then everybody will think I should be buying my Christmas things. And so they kind of leveraged the buy-in of Thanksgiving into a commercial success. And so today, that parade is in the streets of New York, and it's really one of the largest in the world. And it includes bands, and now they have Broadway performances in the middle of it. I forgot to remove that part on the bottom. This is not part of the Kenzo digital work. This takes parade, the parade just has these massive balloons. And these balloons are something that have their own kind of identity too. And it's one thing to see them marching down the street this way. That's the easy way to watch it on television as they're coming down. But it's this kind of way they appear from the street, the hovering over top of you, the giant kind of image that's up there, and even the large turkey over there sitting on the side. There's kind of a weirdness to that. It's unsettling to see them quite so large and to see this kind of barrage of images coming down. It really turns into an event. It's not just a series of these kind of kitsch objects in there. It's the larger volume of them together that creates this sense of event. And of course, part of this being an American is television. And so the idea of Thanksgiving then is appropriated by the commercial television networks. And so this idea of football on Thanksgiving becomes American football, not soccer, becomes a big thing. So this national narrative now includes your family dinner in between football games and making sure that everything can work out time-wise that way. So here you see that kind of appropriation of the football players pretending to eat their meal with you while you're eating your meal, and the flag and everything else. But it is true. This is our family from a few years ago. We have 4 generations sitting at this table enjoying our time together because time is passing and some of these people have passed on. So that's why this is a special picture for me. And yeah, you can say, how come you haven't painted your window frames yet? I'll get around to it. It's important to be there with the family this week, okay? And we did have turkey, corn, mashed potatoes, and cranberries, but there's no football. So if I look at Halloween, what can I learn from Halloween? This is just something I saw in my email this morning as I was checking my email. Because we camp so much, we get things from the national government about using the national parks and things like that. So they said, have a fabulous Halloween adventure. So fabulous is a variation on fabulous for the non-native English speakers. And it's telling you America is filled with ghost town, graveyards, other spooky little hidden corners. And so down below, you have some of these amazing places that they've turned into parks. But some of them involve the cannons you can see there from the American Civil War, where North and South fought each other and hundreds of thousands of people died. And then a few of these natural places that have an interesting significance to them. But it really comes from immigrants. So my immigrant families brought this over with them. The pre-Christian tradition, especially in parts of the UK, transitioning to winter, long nights, people thought about the dead, they put together different rituals and thinking about it. And so when Catholicism hits that part of Britain in that era, it becomes this blended kind of thing where some of those pieces traded with each other, became assimilated. And so the harvest festivals involved dressing up in costumes. It was called guising, like disguising today. And All Hallows Eve, before All Saints Day, became Halloween. So this is a huge thing in the United States. I know you have All Saints Day because I'm going to be out looking at some of the wooden churches and what happens here during that day. But All Hallows Eve is a huge thing in the United States. These are people dressed as witches in 1910. And then as those people came more and more from Scotland and Ireland, it became a larger thing. It wasn't just for those immigrants, it became a larger national thing. And those folk holidays got mixed up with the marketing, like we were talking about Thanksgiving. So here you see children in homemade costumes in the 1930s. In that era, the children would go out and ask for candy, and that's called trick-or-treating. But they would make the costumes at home. But by 1950s, they were mass-producing costumes. You could buy your own mask and a small smock or outfit that you wore. And it's always been a cultural place for Americans to express their fears as well as that memory. So in the top center there, from my youth and a few in the room, the Cold War with the Soviet Union Russia was a huge thing in the United States. So the launching of Sputnik, someone dressed as Sputnik for Halloween there, that was a huge thing. It was a way of getting our fears out. And so, the rebirth in popular culture of movies and horror and things like that, you have this simple thing of a clown becoming now an object of horror. And then, of course, we have some politics that evolve fears as well, as you can see there on the right. But this idea of dealing with death has always been a cultural phenomenon. How do we deal with death? Now, this is a beautiful place in the United States called Chimney Rock in southwest Colorado. Up in the mountains, a unique rock formation you can see there in the lower left picture of a ridge that has two chimneys, as they call them, because of their shape. Well, the ancestral Puebloan people saw that as a location where there's what's called a lunar standstill occurs if you're at a particular location viewing through those. And they built a village there. In the lower left up there, you can actually see the village, the first spire, the second spire, and then on the third mound is the village. And so this is inside that village, looking at that point where the lunar standstill occurs. So they had a spiritual significance to that place. And even though they left that place probably in the 1100s, early 1100s, their ancestors in the Pueblo world still think this is a spiritually inhabited place. So if I talk to my friend in Zuni, he'll say I was really happy to be playing with my dance group at Chimney Rock, because to them this is an ancestral homeland. It's never been spiritually abandoned. If I go to the Pacific Northwest, when the colonists came and started to encounter them, They found these boxes in trees. There, what they did with the dead was place them in boxes and put them in trees next to the village. And so they were curled up in a fetal position and often given all of their regalia from the ritual life that's there with them. And so this was something they really didn't know what to make of this. For the colonists coming in, this spiritual tradition, like the spiritual traditions of the Native Americans in the Southwest, were beyond their comprehension. There wasn't room in the Christian, their version of Christianity, to accept this kind of thing. Here, one of the reasons I'm here is because I went to my grandmother's place of birth, Repchice, a little bit west of the Tatras and north of Orava, to find where my ancestors were. And as Anne and I walked through looking at the names, the surnames on the tombstones, I found about 30 of my surname people here, which made me extremely emotional. But we hadn't noticed what was happening around us, which was this incredible preparation with the candles and flowers, unlike anything we see in America. So this picture for me is why I'm here. And I saw that and I thought, I've got to go back. I can't leave after this. I have to go back and understand this culture and why they are this careful care for the dead. And so that's an extremely important time for me. And probably is why I'm here instead of Finland. And while America remains nominally Christian across many denominations, it's very secular, it's agnostic, minority atheist. But in that in between all of those things, there's a popular culture still associated with the occult and other forms of spirituality. So here you see a palm reader, a psychic, right on the waterfront in Santa Cruz, California, up the coast from us. It's a very first world tourist-based thing. This wouldn't be there unless people were seeking this kind of thing. And so if we take those ideas, Halloween's a family event in a lot of ways. The decorations mean a lot. That harvest remnant is thought of through the object of the pumpkin and the carved pumpkin that used to bring out light to scare away the spirits in the Celtic side of thinking is still there to light the outside of the house. But the decorations have gotten ridiculous. They're very expensive. If you don't have time to decorate your house, you can get animated newly dead skeletons that I imagine move somehow. I wish I had I didn't get a video of that. And you can also get animated dueling banjo skeletons, which talks about the rural part of America there. These aren't cheap. If I didn't do my transfer, but I would imagine that's like over 100 euros, 120 euros or something like that for the one on the left. The other one's cheaper if you want. And the children's costumes have gotten very elaborate and very expensive too. So you don't have to worry about making a costume or having one of those cheesy costumes, those kitsch costumes. You can have a real costume. But again, they're very expensive too. And when I think, since many of the students in the room here are women, I would ask you don't have too many choices up there. You can be a fairy princess or a fairy or maybe a witch. But you can't be an astronaut or a ninja. So even though America is very egalitarian, there's constant gender bias. And if you're faculty, you can get people dressed up like you. These are all my students dressing up like me a few years ago. I'm usually wearing this black vest and black outfit. So I was very happy that they honored me by dressing up as me. And there's also a little button I'm wearing that is a university effort to make people be nice. You wouldn't think you'd have to ask people on a university campus to be nice, but it said empathy, respect on it. And you wouldn't think you had to have that, but we need it. So this thing gets blown up, and now it's a world thing. Disney is exporting this everywhere. So Disney hosts Halloween celebrations across the globe. This is from their website. It scares me to death. Okay, and it brings Disney villains front and center. Why would they do that? Money. It's all about money. So this thing that has this spiritual center that gets all kind of wrapped up in different spiritual traditions meeting, and then gets blown up in parades and football and television. It's coming your way. Be very careful what you accept. So what can we discern about America from those types of things that I've shown you? It's very hard to call anything American. This is what I told my students in my American built environment class. 400 years of immigration, scale, geography, differences in politics, spirituality. A single narrative is really hard to put together for America. And if I'm an environmental designer and I look at the ecological footprint, there isn't one America. This will show me there's at least 9 right now. If I want to design ecologically, there is no America to design for. I'm looking at things locally and regionally. Well, one thing I think you can learn from those playing with themes in those 2 holidays is looking back at this piece by Edmund Burke that I've always found fascinating, and in this inquiry of the sublime and the beautiful that he wrote a long time ago. There's a piece there that I've highlighted on the right. And it's in a form of English that uses S's that look like F's. So I've put this in text for you. I imagine it could only be from a diligent examination of our passions, from a careful survey of the properties of things which we find by experience to influence those passions, and from a sober and attentive investigation of the laws of nature by which those properties are capable of affecting the body and thus exciting our passions. So if I scratch my head a little bit, I think, wow, if one studies phenomenology, what Burke is calling for is not a formal or form-based idea of beauty and the sublime. He's talking about a relational one with things. And it's the relation across the thing to you that is the exciting part. So in Halloween, we have a suspension of belief about what the norms are. In Burke's Sublime, he talks about what we would call today in aesthetics effect or atmosphere, challenging fears through improvisation and optimism that they can be overcome. And what I would say is a qualitative hedonism, hedonism about the qualities all around you, the candy you're going to get, the outfit that you've disguised yourself in, the act of tricking someone if they don't give you candy with throwing toilet paper on their tree or something like that. So there's an immediacy behind this hedonism that I think is fantastic. And if I look at Thanksgiving, I see this quest for a national narrative. People want to believe those things, even if they aren't true. Having a past and a family, in a way, it's very idealist, But I think it can also say maybe it has pieces of Burke's idea of beauty associated with that too, because there's another form of hedonism you might call virtue hedonism. It's a good form of hedonism. It's about what's positive that we want to hold in that narrative that we put together. But because you're eating the turkey and you've got this massive meal that you're going to gorge yourself on, there's also this immediacy. So it's about a past that's fabricated and pulling it together in this immediate time. But I think there also are real things to be afraid of in America. This is the coast of California here on the left with my home there in red. And if you look off to the east, our utility companies are shutting down people's power. Maybe only for an hour or so, but they're shutting it down. Can you imagine that, getting an email saying, tomorrow we're going to shut down your power because we don't have enough? And they're anticipating lack of ability. So when I see the concerns about gas prices and things in the UK where there's queues at petrol stations and things, I'm thinking, we're already there in my part of America. The other thing is we have this climate change aspect that's coming in. It's a real fear. I have. Sea level rise, intensity of storms, extremes. But if you look at this map up above, this is terrifying to me. California is there on the left side. It's got red, and then it's got the dark brown. The dark brown is the worst category for drought. The dark brown is in the Central Valley, which grows most of the United States food. Okay, probably some of the world food. I don't know if some of it comes over here. And then if you look at the red, it's the surrounding Sierra Mountains. That's where the water that we drink in California comes from, the snow melt from the Sierra Mountains. And it extends all the way to the coast. Literally the whole state of California, with an exception of the most southern part. They don't put Mexico in here because Mexico doesn't exist to Americans, or Canada. We don't need those parts on a map. But if you look down at the bottom of California toward Mexico, it's the only part that's not in a severe drought. So what does that mean if you're an environmental designer for architecture? Well, this is the landscape in California now. There's a lake, it was probably on a reservoir. They probably use it for drinking and irrigation locally. You can see the level that it's dropped during this drought. This is just from this last spring. You can also see there's been a fire. The fire is more intense because of the drought. The fire spreads more quickly because of the intensity of the winds associated with the storms from climate change. And you can see the house that was there is gone. So we've decided to build in places that potentially are going to be evaporated in the future. So as someone who used to be a planning commissioner in our town, how do you plan for this? How do you allow architecture? What's the best architecture for this? This is another reality. I want a beautiful form, but this is another reality I have to take care of. Americans love leisure time. They prize their leisure. I think it's not unfair to say most people work for the time to afford a quality leisure. They work so they can go on vacation. They work so they can leave where they are to go somewhere else. That's the place I want to be, not where I'm at. And so there's, in some ways I can say from that as an architect, well, that means you're interested in qualities. When I'm going to take that time, where do I go? What are the qualities that are there? I can start to assemble what's an attractor for people that way. It may be that it's manufactured by Disney, but underneath that, there's still an attractor somewhere. America has no deep past or built legacy that it recognizes. There are few traces. The colonists and the American Revolution are only 400 years of history in the built world. So if I go through Bratislava a few weeks ago, here's a gate from a palace, 1658. It's still here. It's waiting to be reborn in some new Esterhazy Palace project. If I go into the cathedral, which has been burned and damaged and had a freeway built in front of it, there's still the remnant of some original piece on the wall. We don't have anything like that in America. We like to wipe it clean. You know, America loves spectacles and lights. It's the sense of immediacy. This is from a Christmas village near us that you pay a ridiculous amount of money to go through, but they have acres and it takes you an hour to go through all the lights that are there. It's just a massive Thanksgiving of lights in the darkness. Americans get a multimedia attack of the senses about every issue that's of value to those in power. You're constantly being swayed in American media to arrive at a binary of yes or no. Do you agree with me? You must. If you do, you're my friend. If you don't agree with me, you're evil. There is no in between. The index has no middle. And this idea that Americans love a simple message and eye candy, to a degree, is true. But there's been so many falsehoods, especially the last 10 or 15 years, that Americans are starting to be easily dismissive. I don't want to pay attention to that. You haven't convinced me there's anything here to pay attention to. And they're also highly suspicious and cynical. You may get that sense from me, and you probably are right. I'm suspicious and cynical about everything in American culture. So this was just something I found on a site where they were talking about this bizarre mix of SpongeBob SquarePants and Barack Obama talking about some topic, because they want to hit this whole range of media to convince you. I think it ultimately goes back to this kind of idea of the sublime. Inside that sublime, there's a quality there talking to us. And I think it's more vibrant than the one that talks to us from beauty. Beauty may be in that Thanksgiving dinner, but the rest of it, I think, is motivated by the sublime. If I look at a place like New York, and I look at all these new buildings that have been built there and the remnants of the World Trade Center being reborn, they're beautiful objects in a way. I always think that the same people who design electric razors design office buildings. And I think there's formal qualities about them that can be debated. But to me, it's the experience of the city being different and immersive that's really what counts about it. New York is an amazing city because of those buildings. It's an amazing thing because of what happens on the street. You know, so here's something that I think pays attention to that. This is a new building that has an installation built into it by this artist, Kenzo Digital. And when you look at that, it's the real place, and it's the perceptions of the real place and playing with you in your phenomenal field that makes it exciting, I think. And you go up a glass elevator to get there. And so it's this interesting sublime between the real and the perceived unreal, having a dance with each other. And I think it's fantastic. Euphoric and multisensory in a sublime atmosphere is what I would add. I can look at something like this. This is one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken. Here I am in New York. It's probably December, so it's after Thanksgiving. But they're getting ready for Christmas. So you see Radio City Music Hall, which is part of Rockefeller Center, which is one of the major office building developments post-war to be built, is there. And then there's this kind of street cart offering all sorts of goodies to you that's trying to attract you. And there's this dialogue between this corporate tower that has this beautiful base and this street cart. And it's that tension in the street between those two things that I think is beautiful. Not the building, not necessarily the street cart, probably not what they were selling, although it probably was pretty reasonable. Bagels are great from street carts in New York. But that's what interests me. It's that encounter with those things. And this is what I was talking about before. In America, we don't have this situation. We've erased everything. We want a tabula rasa, this blank slate. And I think that'll change over time. I think the generation I'm teaching, I hope, will change that. This was bizarre to me, seeing the piece of this, what I took to be a school. My Slovakian language was still in its infancy at the time, but I think it was a school built over top of the wall. So as an architect, I'm looking at this and I say, I want to be in that building, that room that has the window that goes through the wall, the stone wall. That's the one that interests me. The part up above, it's just a basic modernist thing. It's too abstract. But give me that part that's looking through the wall. That would be sweet to have. Maybe the one right on top of the wall where I can look down and see the stone at the top of the wall. So what do? You teach a different way. This is the way I teach the freshmen. I reinvented this program a few years ago. We took the whole cohort of architects and architectural engineers out to this local pier. So instead of teaching them to draft, we said, we're going to use drafting to recreate this pier. So they all broke into teams, they measured it, they drew it, they had to rebuild it. There it is in the built form down below with an investigation that they did about their part of the pier. So that to me was better than the vocational idea of teaching drafting. It was about the physicality of being on that place and the affection that you develop for it. It gives you a different attitude toward what would be the next part that you would take on that pier if you were a designer, which is what their small model was that they attached. And then the idea that you can work in a group rather than an isolated person. I think that's a really important thing for people in school to know. I didn't do anything as an architect, certainly not as a community planner by myself. It was a network of things that was very important. So learning to leverage a network of your peers as you go through is really important. In second year, when I took on some of those studies, I would start my students with this dumpster diving exercise, and we were going to be doing a small performance space, so they had to be performers. They made their instruments, we performed them in the middle of our stair court out of the pieces that they assembled and remade. We have a beautiful shop that allows us to do woodwork and metalwork, and they're all very good at that. And so you can see my student ensemble they're playing. They didn't sound very good. They're not very good musicians, but the pieces they made were pretty good. And this is what studio is like for us. Most people look at this and are terrified. And I look at this and I think, I just want to be there. Because this is the way you learn. You don't learn through concepts. You learn through concepts being developed. And how do they play out? What if? Lateral thinking. So preliminary studies, secondary studies, tertiary studies, model. Maybe we'll do something at full scale to understand how it works. but you create this legacy of stuff that's just mind-blowing. I love it. Can I do that online? I can't imagine how to do that online. Never. Can I do a lecture online? Yeah. That? No. So when I taught thesis a few years ago, I started a thesis lab for a friend who was going to be on sabbatical. I only teach two of our 4 quarters a year anymore. But this is what one of my students made for the vellum furniture competition. She asked me if she could do a piece of clothing. I said, of course. She said, can I do a hat? I said, of course. What are you going to make the hat out of? Balloons, I think. What's it going to look like? I don't know. I'm going to improvisationally keep adding to it. So there it is at real scale when she was done, superimposed on the model. And because she has Asian American ancestry, she's very interested in some of the Japanese graphic phenomena now. So she's placed that as part of her thesis in there. So it's this idea of an optimism, an improvisational thing, a reaction to the work that you do, a physicality, a scale. Those are the things I think are important about architecture. Those are the things I think are emerging in American architecture. It's a qualitative aspect. So these people continued with my colleague Doug Jackson for the remainder of the year. And this is me with them in London on a field trip, because it's important that you have that social bonding and go out and practice togetherness together. It's not just about what they did in the studio, it's about trusting each other and learning together as a group. So this kind of bonding, I think, is critical when you have a group of people together to make them respond as a critical unit together. And this is the type of thing that we see. They aren't isolated people in a small regional school, which is what Cal Poly was in the 1960s. You know, we're one of the most competitive schools to get into for architecture in the world. And when you get there, we want to deliver. So we do things like, this was the field trip to London we took. So this is Lord Rogers' studio, one of the great modernist architects, looking from the building he designed out onto London with St. Paul. There's St. Paul's in the middle. It's this idea of reversing and seeing what's back behind us in the studio. I always enjoyed that picture. Kind of reminded me of a UFO kind of sci-fi thing. And this is what the outcome might be. This is back when I taught thesis all year long, about 10 years ago. One of the students told me, for the end, when we do an installation, I'm going to bring a trailer for my installation. I said, what are you going to do with the trailer? He said, I'm going to use it for my model, but I'm going to turn it into a DJ stand too. So an arm extended out of this that he was playing all the stuff during the show. So that's why the amplifier is there. When we had the actual opening of the show, he was playing things on the trailer in the middle of his model with the lowrider lights on, which are the lights Hispanic culture puts under their car to light the base so you can see what's happening to their wheels. So that whole thing comes from his embeddedness in a Hispanic culture, but wanting to express it in amazing ways. And then another student of mine said, I think I'm going to do my model out of auto parts. And so these are actually fenders and parts of an automobile. This model was probably about 8 feet long, 2.5 meters. At a very large scale, replicating pieces of a rail yard in Guadalajara where she was from. And so this is something you can't get these types of models using normative techniques. You don't have that piece of wood that's this long that you may turn into a wall. You can't bend it like this. You know, you can't think of the possibility of this with certain kinds of tools. But if you let people explore things laterally, they find opportunities to bring in something new. It's highly intuitive, it's highly speculative, but I think that's an American quality to thinking about architecture. This is the type of thing that came out of Doug Jackson's studio 6 months after I left. Nowadays, 3D printing is capable of doing those things. I don't need an auto part to do it. I can actually 3D print these amazing kinds of structures that people have. So there's somebody exploring a high-rise in the background, and here's someone who's doing something more about the LA street culture and roads and networks you drive into this building. But it always came from things I learned as a practitioner back in the 70s and 80s. So it's about looking for the opportunities when something is there. So we were given this log house In a river town, you can see there on the left, it used to be a factory town. This was housing for the workers. And now the factory's gone and they were turning these into individual dwellings. So they wanted us to multiply the size of this house about 4 or 5-fold. And so they wanted us to do it without it being seen that it was that large. So you see down on the right, yeah, you can still see the house seems pretty small. But if you look at it from the lower left, you see it's extending up the hill quite a bit. We kind of stealthed it behind that tiny image up there, because that's where the opportunity was to hide it. And it was along a stream, so we pulled out a little bay window. And they wanted to look down into the valley, so behind that top ridge is a deck that you can look down, but you don't see anybody out on that deck. And so it's this idea of looking at something and deciding, should the logs be visible outside or inside? We can't do both. We have to make it so that there's enough insulation, that the place will be comfortable, the wind won't blow through. So we chose to put it on the inside, where it has an impact. But there you can see the finished product. So a bit of a whisper from what's there, while being really different inside. This is one of the last projects I worked on before I came out to teach. And it was, the basic project was put a roof over this courtyard. We want to turn it into a place to eat. And what I looked at when I saw this was these massive buildings that just seemed horrible, almost heavy and foreboding. They didn't seem friendly to me at all. And yet they wanted people to come down to this lower level. And the only thing we could think of was, we have to make it bright. And we have to make it bigger than it actually is, because those buildings around us are so huge. And so intuitively, we came up with this idea of breaking the roof up into planes and letting the light come down through different ways. And what I always liked about this photo was it was primarily there because of the evening school that they had. They intended to grow the university by teaching at night, so people who worked during the day could come there at night. So really what they wanted was something at night that drew people in to eat there. So this ended up being a pretty great picture, I thought. I was really happy with this. This was a project that was a minor project in our office, but if you're an architect, nothing is a minor project. Everything's an opportunity. So it's one of my favorite projects that I ever had. This is the poster picture that I gave to Tomasz. Thank you for the poster. Why did I call this an American experience? People would go there in Vienna, you would go there to experience that Baroque space. That would be the European experience, the traditional aesthetic one. I'm going for the icon, I'm going for the paintings on the wall, I'm going for the object building. For me, I saw the scaffolding and the mylar balls inside. I thought, this is great. I want to climb the scaffolding. Couldn't do it. My wife would let me do it anyway. But I was just mesmerized by the impact of the effect of the mirroring of those spheres, what I was seeing around me. It was a reference back to me, because I can actually see myself in the bottom of that reflection. And so I've been brought into the space in a totally different way. And that idea of the Baroque space being modeled in a really different way, it's why it's such a fascinating point in architectural history. Now it has another thing modifying the space inside that gives a total illusion as to where the boundaries of space are. So that's why I called that an American encounter with the Baroque. It is a Baroque building, but that's an American encounter with the Baroque building. And so this is the last two slides I'm going to leave you with. That's our granddaughter on the beach where we live. And this is part of a poem. Delve, mold, pile the words of the earth. Work on, it is materials you bring, not breaths. Work on, age after age. Nothing is to be lost. It may have to wait long, but it will certainly come in use. When the materials are all prepared, the architects shall appear. I swear to you, they shall appear without fail. I swear to you, they will understand you and justify you. I swear to you, by the greatest among them shall be he who knows you best and encloses all and is faithful to all. I swear to you, he and the rest shall not forget you. They shall perceive that you are not an iota less than they. I swear to you, you'll be glorified in them. So those are the words of one of America's greatest poets, Walt Whitman, talking what I think is about the future of architecture. The best architecture is in the future. We don't have the best ones yet. I've always felt that as an architect. I felt that as a faculty member. So that's what I'll leave you with today. My image of my granddaughter, who I hope becomes an architect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your perfect lecture. And now I would like to give you a word. If you have any questions or remarks, now it is the time.
I'm sorry if I used too many words. But I had a lot of pictures. Yes. Yes.
My background is different. Linguistics, which we use vernacular for children. First time we use that sort of class. So what's vernacular?
That's a great question. I'm sorry there's a gap between what American usage is in certain terms and architectural usage of certain terms versus what is here. One of the great things that I think happened in my lifetime was right as I was going to school in the 70s, there was a major book put out by an author named Rudolfsky, and he called it Architecture Without Architects. And what he was looking at was the tradition worldwide of what structures were part of the local traditions wherever they had been for a long time. So they were looking at mud houses in Africa. They were looking at some of the Pueblo constructions in the American Southwest. And I would say if they had been in a place like Slovakia, they would be looking at the wooden churches and the different traditions of building. There was a fascination with when modernism seemed to be taking over the world through the process of globalization, that it was a very abstract kind of idea where local place meant nothing. The Romans would put up the same fortification wherever they went. North Gate, South Gate, etc. And there was this idea that modernism was the same thing. It was coming in as an empire and just taking over with no local recognition. Well, the response to that was, let's look at the local traditions everywhere. And so the term vernacular is meant to cover all of those local building traditions and to respect them as another variant so that you didn't have one kind of architecture. You had a new architecture that was learning what it was about, but you had an old architecture that, for whatever flaws it had real specific engagement with a place for a long time. The reason I don't like to dismiss historical things very easy is some of those engagements happen over such a long period of time. The challenges we have ecologically today and with other issues, they had to deal with for so long in a specific place. And that doesn't mean that that's the only way to respond to those places. There's another argument that I'll talk about in the next lecture that's called genius loci, the spirit of place argument. And I think that's another dangerous one to talk about because it has nostalgia built into it. So how do you respect the past of the vernacular and how do you build upon that as opposed to just replicating it, which I think is the key thing. So vernacular in this case, when I use industrial vernacular of the Homestead Steelworks, there's a real difference between walking into a steel building. I'm not sure we have steel buildings here. Most things are concrete. But there's a real difference between walking into a modern building made of steel. Most of our large commercial buildings are made of steel. And they feel very different than you walk inside than the industrial facility does. There's a certain rigor to everything needing to be a certain way there that most architecture doesn't have. Most architecture defaults to unusual systems, maybe economically based. But in an industrial facility like that steel mill, the railroad tracks coming through, the cranes that were taking the molten steel, the trucks that came through, there were so many sublime processes over top of each other. The sound that came through there was unbelievable. Sometimes we wore earplugs because the sound was so great. But then there was that part of that I had in the slide was the silence. Go eat your lunch, even if it was 3 in the morning, if you were on the night shift, by the quiet of the river. And the mill and the river were partners. You know, one was loud and one was there. This one had been here thousands of years. This one's new. It's going to be gone 1999. This one's still here. Pay attention to both, you know, but neither one of them was a piece of modern architecture. So that idea of learning from the vernacular is at the core of my thinking. It's the rural vernacular, the farmsteads. When I go through the small villages with the wooden churches and I see the farms, I'm always looking, wow, that's a large farm. How did they do that? And I see the people out picking in the landscape and things like that, the different vegetables and things. And I'm thinking how different that is from where we live, where it's a Mexican population that comes up and does that and then moves to another farm and does it. And it's just to me fascinating. The tractors and the trailers, it's all fascinating to me. But if you're in phenomenology, everything's fascinating to you. But you start with going back and looking at the vernacular, those local precedents, those local building traditions. That's what it's really about.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I'm totally sure we have. Yes.
You are talking about the Hallows Eve
Yeah.
and about education. Have you already noticed any differences or similarities between those our place? Started to service how you notice?
With Rabchitsa?
Repeat the question to the microphone, please.
Okay, so repeat the question. I think I'll get it right. Did I notice differences between the American holiday, the things I perceive from the American holidays in a place like Rabchitsa? Well, I was only there for a few days, so I like this idea, as I've tried to talk about in our class, of time allows you a fast and a slow way to understand place. And the fast way comes from these immediate kind of impacts and affordances. So no doubt in my mind, seeing those graves taken care of that way was one of those affordances that was immediate, a fast kind of placemaking. I'm sure I've over-romanticized that town. My grandmother never spoke Slovak. She never said a word to me in Slovakian. She never talked about it. She never mentioned it once in my entire life. So I'm sure for her, she left. And it never was to be a thing in her life again. I don't know if that was trauma. I don't know if there was a story behind that, except that she's the only one in the family that came. They got everything they had, I think. My romantic version is they got everything they had together to get her out of that situation they saw in the crumbling of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They thought it was going to be bad. And I guess she did too, as in her reflection. But when I go there, I'm looking at those graves all belong to my people. I know her surname. I know they were there. I know they farmed that area for generations. The surname suggests it's Klinovsky, that they came from a town called Klin that's not that far away. So I imagine they migrated there at some earlier point. But when I look at the town, there's no large department stores. There's no Novum there. I don't remember seeing any commercial store at all. So I imagine life in the village is a very different thing that I'm thinking about. It may be, I've highly romanticized it. So I'm interested in more my false images than I am of my true images, which I'll always hang on to. I know my great-grandfather was there. I saw where he's buried. You know, I know my great-grandmother was there. So those things are powerful to me. So there's that attachment because of lineage. But yet I don't feel that same attachment to my home where I grew up. I didn't show you any places where I grew up except my grandfather's ancestral farm, where the homestead works where I worked when I was your age. You know, those are different places than where I grew up. I don't have any nostalgia about where I grew up. You know, that's hard for some of my friends to understand, but I don't. I've always traded up. Does that answer your question at all? Okay. Anything else?
Any good questions, please, from this audience? Because we have another question from the online audience.
Okay.
Actually, from Lukasz, who is upstairs at the 5th floor. And he's asking, is this it? He's asking about your opinions on Halloween. And the precise question is, yeah, is this possible that the Halloween was in the USA based on transformation of real fear into something else, like spectacle?
Yes, I think that's very probable. The idea of spectacle, I think, is a big part of American fascination with certain things. That whole interest in wanting to be part of something larger. You know, spectacle to me means, can you get a large volume of people on the same page, if you want to use that term, about something that's happening. So if you have a stadium event, if you have a giant parade, that's appealing to that sense of wanting to be involved in spectacle. And I think with the idea of a parade, it's a very open-ended thing. You can have marching bands. In the beginning, they had animals come through that were unusual. Now the balloons come through. So I think it's capable of accepting all sorts of plug-in pieces. And I do think it's a way of translating fear into, we can act together. But I think it's also possible to fuel those false narrative type things. A spectacle can lead to some bad things. I'm thinking of the fascinating architectural aspects of the Nuremberg party rallies the Nazis had, with the lights and I think Speer called that the endless stadium or something, where the lights kind of Gothic met above at night. You know, so I think there's an aspect of spectacle that can be misused and leveraged. But I think there's an immediacy to it that I think plays into what's best about the possibility of architecture as well. And that idea of fear and overcoming fear, you need to break from it. You need to say stop for a moment, and that's what I think the spectacle does. I think that's where the big speeches come in the middle of a war, and someone's trying to rally the troops. You have to have a break in the fear to be able to turn and move in a different direction. So I think for societal fear, that's something too. It tells us for a moment here we can take a break and have something together that we can enjoy.
Thank you very much. We have time for last one or two questions. May I ask something?
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to connect to Lukasz's question, because what I felt was, and what I feel always about, for example, American movies and cities and so on, is that Americans maybe have some different sense of scaling. So I would like to ask if you, as American, feel a different sense of scaling in Europe, because as you said, Americans like to be a part of something larger. Do you feel different sensing of scale here in Europe?
Yes and no. I think when I speak to my colleagues who've had a chance to travel and do different things, I think the ability to move from place to place is very different now than it was in my youth. I think about air travel and things like that. And when we send our students to Europe, and from my university, we send a tremendous number of students to Copenhagen and to Florence. And one of the ideas of going there is that you're going to travel a lot. And so they'll come back with this amazing list of places that they've seen, which in my mind, it's like, wow, all these different countries. But you look at them on a map, they're not that far apart. And it was an hour or two flight to get there, maybe 2 hours. So I think we don't have a good scale for Europe, per se. But I think there's a sense of local scale. In that map of the United States, that ability to move on the road network that was constructed after World War II that ultimately turned into what's called the interstate system of roads. And the incredible lowering of the cost of owning an automobile or owning or taking care of the automobile with fuel. It's still, Americans are complaining about gas prices being about $4.50, $5 a gallon right now. That's like, that's nothing compared to what you pay for gas here. So there's this thing about America, I think in the last part of the 20th century, scale is based on ability to move. If ability to move is based on walking, horse, things like that, it's one sense of scale. If you all of a sudden can get in your car anytime you want and drive anywhere you want, and it doesn't cost very much money, the American sense of scale is different in time. Its scale is related to time. Nobody wants to take more than a 3-day weekend to travel. Maybe cheat and make it a 4-day weekend. Students would never do that here, right? You'd never take an extra day off on the weekend. I can imagine how nobody would do that here. But the idea is that's the time I'm going to travel. But in my car, I can drive 70 miles an hour, 90 kilometers an hour for 2 or 3 hours. Be one thing. When I showed you this pictures of the Southwest, when we would leave our home on the coast to get to Flagstaff, where we camp typically the first night, that's a 12-hour drive. In 12 hours from Prussia, am I in Moscow in 12 hours? I don't even, no, not yet. Yeah, I don't know where 12 hours is from Prussia.
You can go, for example, to
Croatia.
Yeah.
Sounds like someone's been to the beach and said it before. Yeah, I think it's relative to those types of things. Plus, again, the United States doesn't have border issues like you've had traditionally in Europe. So the idea of moving those 12 hours without anybody stopping you for any reason, except you've got to go to the bathroom or you've got to put more fuel in the car. There's this sense of the American road. There's actually a American architectural historian, actually it's English architectural historian named Rainer Banham, that when he studied Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s, he actually said the automobile had changed the whole sense of scale and of the United States, and that LA should not be viewed the same way as you viewed a traditional city because of the automobile. There's kind of a post-Banham argument you can make. But I think there's something to be said for that. What's available? What's my experience going to be? And in many parts of the United States, that open road is still there. You're not going through village after village after village. You're going through desert. It still had indigenous names every bit of the way. It was still probably on a trail for trading or hunting or something. But you're on something that there isn't anything else there for hours. And I think that's one of the sublime things, the sense of scale in America, the size of the mountains. The Rocky Mountains dwarf the Alps. You know, the scale of the desert, I think if I look back on there, some of the deserts in the Southwest are larger than Slovakia. And it's that kind of scale that's an American thing. It feeds into the myth of America. Big is good. You know, but I would think, hopefully from what you saw, I would temper that with pay attention to the local. That's important.
Yes, thank you very much.
Sure.
It's very important and I think interesting for us aestheticians that different aesthetics is also determined not just by culture but also by, let's say, geological and geographical aspects.
Yeah. Very
this
relative.
is very interesting. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think, do we have Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Michael, for your lecture. I would like to remind to all of you who were with us, not just here in the room, but also online, that you are warmly invited to our conference where you will have your keynote lecture. And also, I would like to invite you for another or next or let's say a last lecture at our platform Aesthetics Care Forum. And I wrote it down, and it will be, yes, next lecture is on November 25th, and it will be a lecture by Alessandro Bertinetto from the University of Torino. So I'm looking forward, and now thank you very much again. Thank you for being with us.
Excellent, excellent.